Welcome to a chilling Miss Marple mystery. A funeral is announced for a man still alive, then, by nightfall, he's truly dead. Where are you listening from tonight? Tell us below. The church bells of Mary Mead rang solemnly that Thursday morning, their tones drifting through mist and lilac-scented air. It was the sort of day one would expect for a funeral: grey skies, quiet hedgerows, and a faint drizzle clinging to the village roofs. Yet what made it peculiar, as many villagers later remarked, was that no one in the parish had actually died. The notice had appeared the previous evening on the board outside Mary's church. Funeral service for Mr. Harold Pritchard, Thursday, 11 a.m. No one quite knew who had posted it. The vicar, Reverend Clement, was as baffled as anyone else. Harold Pritchard had been alive and hearty when last seen, walking home from the Blue Boar with a newspaper tucked under his arm. By morning, the mystery had drawn the entire village to the fanned churchyard. Curiosity was a powerful force in Mary Mead, almost as powerful as gossip. Miss Hartnell, draped in a black shawl, whispered to Mrs. Price Ridley that she had seen poor Harold that very morning, trimming his hedges as if unaware of his own death. Mrs. Bantry, arriving late, remarked that it was probably some sort of cruel prank, and somewhere in the back row, quietly taking it all in, sat Miss Jane Marple. She was knitting, as usual, though her pale blue eyes missed nothing the nervous flutter of the vicar's hands as he opened his prayer book, the way young Tom Ellison slipped out through the side gate, and the strange expression on Mrs. Pritchard's face. The widow that wasn't a widow looked pale, shocked, and perhaps, though it was a thought, Miss Marple kept to herself a little afraid. The service began, hesitant and confused. Reverend Clement read the opening lines of the burial prayer, only to falter halfway through. A murmur swept through the pews. Then, the heavy church doors swung open, and Harold Pritchard himself stepped inside, dripping with rain, hat in hand, and wearing an expression of startled irritation. "What the devil's all this?" he demanded. Gasps and whispers erupted. Mrs. Pritchard gave a strangled cry and fainted. Reverend Clement dropped his prayer book, and Miss Marple, lowering her knitting ever so slightly, murmured to herself, "Dear me, this is very curious indeed." Outside, the rain fell harder, tapping against the stained glass windows like an impatient hand. By midday, the village was buzzing with theories, some fanciful, some dark. Had someone wished Harold dead? Or was it merely a joke in frightful taste? By evening, however, the laughter had stopped. For at 8:30, as dusk settled over the thatched cottages and lamplight glowed through curtains, Harold Pritchard was found lying motionless at the edge of his garden pond, very much dead this time. And somewhere in the quiet of the lane, Miss Marple paused on her evening walk, the faintest furrow crossing her brow. The trouble with people, she thought, is that they so rarely die when they're supposed to. She turned back toward her cottage, mind already working, piecing together what others would not think to question. "Now," she murmured softly to herself, "why would anyone wish to bury a man before killing him?" Morning broke clear and chill. The village scrubbed bright by rain, as if after a bad dream. Harold Pritchard's cottage looked ordinary behind its clipped yews, except for the rope across the path and Constable Hawes standing solemnly by. The pond beyond the herbs lay flat and grey. There the body had been found at 8:30, cheek to the stone, hat floating among iris leaves. People said he must have slipped. People liked slips. They explained everything and hurt no one's pride. Inspector Slack came with quick steps and a sharper mood, bent, turned the head, and spoke without drama. "Not drowning. See the bruise behind the ear." He went in after. Within an hour, Mrs. Price Ridley possessed the fact and, by a miracle of proprietorship, made it hers. Mrs. Pritchard received them in the parlor, very neat, very pale, hands devastating a handkerchief thread by thread. Reverend Clement murmured comfort. Slack asked practical questions. Cold ham for supper, a complaint about rain. At 9, Harold went to fetch a spade from the shed. Yes, They had quarreled about the absurd funeral notice. "We are not people for spectacles," she said, and kept her eyes on the mantel clock. Miss Marple, quiet at the window with her thin tea, studied the room as one studies a recipe ingredients speak. The clock was 3 minutes fast. A ridge of damp soil ran along the corridor runner toward the kitchen and back again. On the inner knob of the back door lingered a crescent of wet, as if a gloved thumb had paused there and listened. She filed these with 100 memories of tidy wives and untidy husbands. Slack fetched Tom Ellison from the carpentry shed, lanky and defensive. Tom admitted he had printed and posted the funeral notice, as a joke, flushing scarlet as he spoke. "A dare," he muttered. "No harm," Slack snorted. Miss Marple's needles clicked. "The thoughtless amusement of the young," she said mildly, "often becomes a ladder for the careful older sort." Tom stared at the floorboards, as if they might swallow him. In the lane, talk rose like steam. Mr. Badger recalled a quarrel between Harold and Tom over timber. Lily from the Blue Boar, who remembered everything, including what she had not seen, said a stranger in a brown mackintosh had visited Tuesday and paid with a new pound note. He had told her, she said airily, to forget the face. Mrs. Bantry called it theatrical. Miss Hartnell called it wicked modernity. Both felt satisfied. When officials drifted toward paperwork, Miss Marple obtained leave to walk the garden. Near the pond, the air held a whisper of paraffin, not water. It clung faintly to reeds. Harold prided himself on knowing his garden blindfold. He would not have carried a lamp. In the softened border, one wedge-soled shoe print kept its shape-town shoes, fashionable and foolish, pointing toward the side gate. Half sunk in the mud lay a torn ticket for the Wednesday 5:20 bus. The diagonal rip looked like the careless tear she had seen from certain bus conductors and from one particular villager. The shed padlock hung closed but not latched, like a mouth that had forgotten its word. Within, spades and shears stood in tidy disorder, the kind of arrangement made by someone who wished to look careful without knowing the places. Beneath the drooping gooseberry netting, a drag mark scored the earth toward the pond. Miss Marple traced it with her eyes and thought of a small, practiced blow, the sort that leaves scarcely a mark but takes a man's balance and his breath together. Slack met her by the gate. "Burglary gone wrong," he pronounced. "Harold surprises a prowler. Wallop. Splash. Likely enough for a paragraph," Miss Marple agreed. "Yet a staged funeral empties a house beautifully. While Mary sings, a person may search at leisure. Perhaps the visitor did not come to take away, Inspector, but to put something back." Slack scowled. "Put back what?" She looked toward the parlor where Mrs. Pritchard's steady murmur rose and fell. "Something that does not belong in the hands that have it." The next day's sunlight fell sharp across Mary Mead, gilding the roofs and bleaching the wet grass to a pale shimmer. The village looked serene, deceptively untouched, but in truth, something subtle and sour had settled beneath its calm. Death, Miss Marple always thought, never truly visited alone. It brought whispers, doubts, and little acts of rearrangement. By breakfast, the talk of the funeral that came true had spread to every doorstep, each retelling trimmed or embroidered to taste. At the vicarage, Reverend Clement sat with his tea untasted, staring at the newspaper headline, "Local man found dead hours after own funeral announcement." Beside him, Mrs. Clement declared it a punishment for irreverent humor. The Reverend, more thoughtful, murmured that divine retribution seldom operated through bus tickets and bruised skulls. When Miss Marple arrived, invited under the pretext of offering comfort, he looked both relieved and faintly guilty. He had seen that glint in her eye before, when curiosity and compassion began their quiet partnership. She accepted tea, remarked that the hydrangeas were coming in early, and inquired, quite as if it were incidental, whether anyone had called upon the widow. Mrs. Clement said she had, though Mrs. Pritchard was strangely self-possessed. "Grief," Miss Marple said softly, "wears as many faces as there are mirrors in a house. Some choose the one that looks least breakable." A tap at the door, announced Inspector Slack, stiff-shouldered and muddy-booted. He greeted Miss Marple with wary respect. "Afternoon, ma'am. Thought you'd be halfway through knitting the culprit's name by now." She smiled. "Oh, I never knit words. Inspector only patterns. They tell one so much." Slack frowned but took a seat, spreading a small paper packet on the vicar's desk. Inside lay the bus ticket, dried and flattened. "Found near the pond. Conductor says it was issued yesterday evening. Destination: Market Basing. Torn by a right-handed person in haste." Miss Marple studied the faint crease near the tear. "Miss Marple. So whoever held it meant to return," she said, "or wished us to think so." Slack produced a second item, a strip of black cloth, caught on the hedge by the gate, could be from a sleeve or veil. The vicar looked startled. "A woman, then?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple murmured, "but someone who wanted the darkness to do their work quietly." She left soon after, walking back through the high street, where the smell of bread and gossip mingled sweetly. In front of the post office, she encountered Tom Ellison's mother, eyes red from weeping. "He's not a bad boy, Miss Marple," she said desperately. "Just foolish. They've been questioning him since morning." Miss Marple touched her arm. "Foolishness is the seed of wisdom, Mrs. Ellison, if one lives long enough to see it bloom." By noon, Miss Marple was in her own sitting room, a pot of strong tea beside her, and a notebook open to a blank page. She didn't write. She never did. Instead, she ordered her thoughts silently. Much as she might arrange her flower borders, some plants, like clues, looked harmless until they grew together. Harold's mock funeral, Tom's prank, the stranger at the Blue Boar, the scent of paraffin, and the misplaced spade, all parts of a design not yet visible. Her reverie was interrupted by a sharp knock. It was Constable Hawes, looking uneasy. "Beg pardon, miss, but Inspector said you might notice things. There's something odd at Pritchard's again." At the cottage, the small crowd had already formed a human tide that rose wherever mystery pooled. Slack stood by the garden wall, holding a small wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. "Found this, buried under the lilac bush," he said. "Fresh soil. Inside letters." He opened the lid. Dozens of envelopes lay within, some brittle with age, all addressed in the same elegant hand. "To Mrs. Constance Pritchard." Miss Marple took one delicately. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and dust. "They've been kept dry," she said, "and not for sentiment. Look, the folds are too crisp, as if someone only recently handled them." She read a few lines silently, then glanced at Slack. "Oh dear," she murmured, "these aren't from her husband at all. They're love letters from someone who signed only with an initial." Slack scowled. "Blackmail, then." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "Or perhaps a tidy wife decided to unbury her past before someone else did." She replaced the letters, her fingers trembling slightly. A funeral arranged for a living man, and now a burial for secrets. "You see, Inspector, some deaths are planned not for people but for truths." As they left the garden, the wind lifted the last raindrops from the hedge. Miss Marple paused, watching them sparkle briefly before they fell. She had the curious sensation that the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next sound, the next lie to disturb the air. The discovery of the letters cast a new kind of hush over Mary Mead, an expectant, breathless silence that hummed beneath the outward calm of hedges and lace curtains. It was no longer a matter of gossip, but of danger. Miss Marple knew that when private passions step into daylight, they rarely do so alone. Someone always follows with a shadow long enough to cover a grave. By the following morning, the cottage on Ivy Lane was sealed, and Mrs. Pritchard had gone to stay with her sister in Much Benham. At least that was what she told the constable. Yet, as Miss Marple heard from young Amy Gibbs, who worked at the bus stop kiosk, no ticket under that name had been sold. Someone had left the village that morning, yes, but under the name Mrs. Collins, and carrying a small trunk bound for London. That, to Miss Marple, was rather more revealing than the letters themselves. It was the instinct of guilt, not grief, that made people change their names. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, was pleased to have something tangible. He had spent the night comparing handwriting, certain that Harold Pritchard must have discovered the letters and confronted his wife. Motive clear as daylight, he told the vicar when they met in the churchyard. Adultery, blackmail, quarrel. He threatens to expose her. She strikes him. Simple. Miss Marple, who had joined them quietly, smiled with that patient kindness that made men of authority both nervous and fond. Ah, but daylight, Inspector, can be quite deceiving. You may think you're looking at the truth when you're only seeing the reflection in a window. Slack muttered something about reflections, not killing people, but his confidence had already begun to waver. She walked back through the lane, pausing where the lilac bush stood above the buried box. The soil there was disturbed again, not freshly dug, but uneven, as though someone had knelt recently. A piece of string protruded, and when she tugged it free, she found the torn half of an envelope matching those in the box. The name on it was only partly legible. Con. That was enough. Someone had returned to make sure certain words remained unread. That afternoon, Miss Marple went to see Dr. Haydock under the pretense of a checkup. The doctor, cheerful and discreet, poured her a sherry and shook his head over the whole affair. Nasty business, Jane. But, you know, there's something else that doesn't fit. Harold had taken a dose of chloral hydrate before he died, only trace amounts, but enough to make him unsteady. His wife swore he never touched the stuff. I keep wondering how it got there. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. A sleeping draught, isn't it? Quite common in nervous women. One sometimes forgets which glass is which. She left soon after, taking with her a small mental note that felt heavier than any clue. That evening, the village was restless. Curtains fluttered with unseen watchers. Tom Ellison had been released, but the boy was pale and frightened. Miss Marple found him sitting outside the vicarage, kicking at the gravel. "It's my fault," he said miserably. "If I hadn't put up that notice, none of this would have happened." She sat beside him. "Oh, nonsense. Wickedness never begins with a prank. It merely waits for one to cover its prompts. Tracks. Tell me, Tom, when you posted that notice, did you write it yourself?" He nodded. "Yes, miss. But someone told me what to write. Said it'd be a joke, that Mr. Pritchard would have a laugh. Someone?" He hesitated. "A lady. I don't know her name. She had a veil and gloves, said she was from London, visiting friends. Gave me 2 shillings. Miss Marple folded her hands, her eyes thoughtful, and she asked for a funeral notice. Not a wedding, not a fete, a funeral. Tom looked puzzled. She said it was all in fun. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Fun is a word that covers many sins, but it explains quite a lot." When she reached home, twilight had fallen, and the village lay cloaked in that uneasy stillness which comes before revelation. She set down her knitting and gazed out at the empty road, her reflection faint in the glass. The pattern was clearer now, too clear, perhaps. A woman, clever enough to send a boy with a false notice, cunning enough to drug her husband, brave enough to stay and watch his death take root. Yet Miss Marple's intuition whispered that Mrs. Pritchard was not the true spider, only the fly caught in another's web. Somewhere beyond Mary Mead, perhaps on that bus to London, the real author of the letters and the false funeral was already preparing her next move. And Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty, knew that the dead man's story was far from finished. The following morning began with a faint frost on the hedgerows and a silence so complete it seemed the village itself was holding its breath. The inquest was set for noon, and already Mrs. Price Ridley had declared to anyone who would listen that poison always runs in families. Miss Marple, sipping her tea at the window, could see the slow trickle of villagers heading toward the hall like ants following the scent of sugar. Death, she thought wryly, was the one social event everyone felt qualified to discuss. Inspector Slack arrived earlier than expected, a folded report in his hand and an expression that wavered between triumph and frustration. "We've traced the handwriting on those letters," he announced, standing stiffly in Miss Marple's parlor. "Not the wife's. They're written by a woman named Charlotte Vale, lived in Market Basing 15 years ago. Married a shopkeeper, disappeared after a scandal involving forged checks. We think she might be the one your Tom saw under that veil." Miss Marple looked mildly interested but not surprised. "Charlotte Vale," she repeated softly, as if testing how the name felt in the air. "A woman fond of fine paper, bold loops in her script, and a tendency to flatter. I remember hearing of her. She had persuasive qualities." Slack frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning she could make people do foolish things and believe them to be clever ones," Miss Marple replied. "The sort who leaves admiration behind the way others leave. Footprints." Slack tapped the report impatiently. "If she's back in the district, we'll find her. Letters, poison, money, all tie in neatly." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Neatly, Inspector, is a dangerous word. Human nature, you see, rarely ties anything neatly. It knots, frays, and tangles, but never tidies." By midday, the inquest convened. The coroner, a florid man with a dislike for speculation, read the doctor's report in a tone that suggested inconvenience more than tragedy. Harold Pritchard's cause of death: blunt force trauma, followed by drowning. Chloral hydrate traces confirmed. Verdict pending further inquiry. The villagers sat in rows, murmuring like bees. Mrs. Pritchard, veiled in black, appeared composed but brittle. Her eyes darted toward every whisper. When asked to speak, she told her story in careful tones. Her husband had been restless that evening, she said, pacing, muttering about old debts. He'd taken a walk after supper. She'd waited, then gone to bed. Her voice trembled at the edges but never quite broke. It was a performance of grief practiced in silence. After the inquest ended, Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind turning not on the testimony but on a phrase Mrs. Pritchard had used, "old debts." It was the kind of phrase that carried weight far beyond money. In her garden she found young Cherry Goddard waiting anxiously. Cherry, who helped part-time at the post office, was red-faced and out of breath. "Miss Marple, you mustn't think me a gossip, but there's something I ought to tell you." Miss Marple, who never discouraged such confessions, gestured her inside. "Go on, dear." "It's about those letters," Cherry said. "Yesterday, after the police took them, a telegram came to the post office, addressed to Mrs. Pritchard, no sender's name. It said, 'Silence is safety. Burn everything.' I wasn't supposed to see it, but Mr. Symes was out, and I had to log the receipt." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-loop. "And you didn't tell Inspector Slack?" "I meant to, but he was shouting at poor Tom again." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Yes, Inspector Slack's enthusiasm is sometimes louder than it is accurate. You did perfectly right to come to me." She set the needles down, her eyes thoughtful. "Burn everything. That's not a warning one sends to an innocent woman, my dear. That's the kind one sends to an accomplice." Evening came cold and clear. From her cottage window, Miss Marple could see the faint glow of lamps at the vicarage and the darker outline of Ivy Lane beyond. Somewhere out there, a woman with a false name and a dangerous pen was waiting for news, perhaps even watching the village settle under its usual cloak of decency. Miss Marple, pouring herself a final cup of tea, murmured, "Whoever sent that telegram still believes Mrs. Pritchard can keep a secret. But the dead, you see, are far less discreet than the living." She leaned back in her chair, listening to the clock tick, the faint hum of distant voices fading into the night, and thought of Charlotte Vale, the woman who made fools of others and then buried their laughter beneath respectability. It would not be long, she knew, before such a woman found that Mary Mead was a village that forgot nothing and forgave even less. The next morning arrived pale and misted, the kind of day that blurred hedges and hedgerows into watercolor shades of grey, leaving the village seemingly untouched, yet subtly altered. Miss Marple walked through the dew-damp lane, her gaze deliberate, cataloguing impressions. A bent gate latch, a trailing ribbon caught on the hedge, a footprint half-sunken near the post office steps. Each detail, so ordinary to a passing eye, spoke volumes to one who knew how small disturbances concealed great secrets. The post office itself was alive with rumor. Cherry Goddard, behind the counter, whispered hurriedly as she handed Miss Marple a small envelope that had arrived overnight. There was no return address, no postmark, only a faint scent of lavender and the neatest penmanship Miss Marple had ever seen. She broke the seal slowly and read the few words inside. Your curiosity draws nearer. Observe the lilies at dusk. They will reveal what the day conceals. Miss Marple folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket, her mind already tracing the possibilities. Lilies at dusk. The wording was deliberate, almost theatrical. Whoever sent this had a penchant for symbols, for making statements with the smallest of gestures. She thought immediately of Charlotte Vale, the woman whose cleverness had begun to stir the village into a web of confusion and fear. Yet the phrasing suggested a hint of mockery, as if the writer enjoyed the thought of someone unraveling their own mystery while the true intentions remained hidden. By late morning, Inspector Slack arrived, flustered and more anxious than usual. We've been through the letters again, he said, thrusting a folder into her hands. Handwriting comparison, ink analysis, paper types. Nothing new. But, Miss Marple, there's something else. Harold's personal ledger is missing. Entirely gone. We suspect it was taken the night he died. There are entries that could explain, well, almost everything. Miss Marple nodded. People often hide what they fear the world will see, Inspector. And when that fear is shared between more than one, it becomes a secret that walks, talks, and waits. Slack scowled. It's more than a secret. Whoever has that ledger knows who Harold Pritchard was beyond the image the village had. Could be money, could be dealings, could be love letters we don't know about. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the hedgerows lining the lane, or a combination. The ledger could contain nothing, yet be the perfect tool to suggest everything. Fear works faster than evidence, you know. That afternoon, she decided to visit the pond at Harold's garden. The frost had melted into a slick layer over the stone, and the reeds quivered in a weak breeze. She traced the edge with careful eyes and hands, noting a disturbance in the mud near the willow, a mark that indicated something heavy had been lifted or dragged. Not the body itself, she decided, but an object of importance, something that had been removed with care. Her thoughts returned to the ledger. Walking back through the lane, she met young Tom Ellison again, huddled near the bus stop, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Tom, she asked gently, do you remember the lady who asked you to post the funeral notice? Anything else you noticed? Tom's eyes flickered nervously. She had a way of looking right through you, Miss Marple, like she could see your thoughts before you even had them. He shivered, and she carried a little case. Dark wood, metal clasp. She opened it for a moment. I didn't see what was inside, but it looked important. Miss Marple's lips tightened. And that, my dear boy, is precisely the sort of detail that others overlook. She trusted no one but herself with what she carried. By evening, a faint light lingered in the western sky, and Miss Marple sat once more by her window, considering the day's discoveries. Someone had orchestrated Harold Pritchard's demise with careful timing. The fake funeral, the drug, the final blow, the ledger's removal. And all the while, the real puppet master observed, weaving psychological pressure through small hints and symbols, the telegram, the note about lilies, the careful handling of letters. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly, letting the puzzle settle in her mind. She had pieces now more than any ordinary observer, certainly, but she knew well that puzzles of the human heart were not solved by accumulation alone. Observation, patience, and understanding the tendencies of the living would reveal the truth. And the lilies, she decided, would speak when the hour and the observer were both ready. As darkness gathered, she felt a familiar thrill. The plan of Charlotte Vale, or whoever had orchestrated these events, was clever, daring, but it bore the hallmark of human folly, the assumption that others are blind, that patience is weakness, that a single misstep will go unnoticed. Miss Marple, quiet and unassuming, already knew where to look next. The game had truly begun. The next morning dawned pale, the village still shrouded in mist, with frost clinging to the hedgerows and the last traces of dew turning cobblestones to silver. Miss Marple walked slowly through the lanes, her senses alert to the faintest disturbance. Each footprint, each bent twig, and the subtle gleam of damp soil told her a story if one only knew how to read it. At the Blue Boar, the usual bustle seemed subdued, replaced by whispers and sidelong glances. Lily, the waitress, looked unsettled, wringing her hands as Miss Marple approached. "Miss Marple, it's terrible. Mrs. Pritchard returned to the village last night. I saw her slipping in near the pond just as the moon rose." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Near the pond?" she murmured. "Interesting. Was she alone?" "Yes, miss. Though I thought I saw a shadow behind the yews, but perhaps it was just a trick of the moonlight." Moonlight, shadows, subtle movements, these were the very things Miss Marple counted upon. She nodded, offering Lily a reassuring smile, then set off toward the path leading to the pond. The mist had thickened, curling about the tree trunks like gauze. She noticed immediately that the frost was disturbed in places, leaving tracks that suggested careful pacing. A lady, small in stature, had circled, hesitated, and moved again. Whoever it was, she had been mindful not to leave obvious marks, yet Miss Marple noted them all. Near the pond's edge, the water shimmered faintly under the pale light, reeds quivering. Miss Marple crouched and ran her fingers along a slight depression in the soil. Something heavy had been dragged here recently, something that had not yet been returned. The faint scent of paraffin lingered again, mingling with the cold night air. She smiled faintly to herself. It seemed someone had been revisiting the scene, perhaps to ensure a crucial detail remained hidden or to retrieve a misplaced object. From behind the yews, a soft rustling announced that she was not entirely alone. Miss Marple turned calmly, though her heart quickened slightly not from fear, but from the satisfaction of engagement. A figure emerged, veiled, hands gloved, delicate but purposeful. It was unmistakably Mrs. Pritchard, carrying a small wooden case clutched to her chest. "You should not be here, Miss Marple," she whispered, a touch of fear threading her tone with authority. "I thought you might have something to show me." "Miss Marple," replied gently, stepping closer. "A lady who walks the mist alone at midnight often carries more than she intends. Perhaps you are afraid someone else will see what I already suspect." "Mrs." Pritchard's gloved fingers tightened on the case. "It is nothing at all. Just some papers. Private matters." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Private matters, my dear, are often the very things that turn a village upside down. May I see?" The widow hesitated, then sighed, as though acknowledging the inevitability of exposure. She set the case on the ground and opened it carefully. Inside were documents, ledgers, letters, and faintly perfumed envelopes, each meticulously arranged. Miss Marple examined them quietly, noting dates, names, and small annotations in a neat hand that was not Mrs. Pritchard's own. "You see, Miss Marple." "Mrs." Pritchard murmured, "I never touch these. They are from Charlotte Vale. I was only supposed to keep them safe, to ensure nothing untoward happened. I did not know he would, he. Her voice broke, and she fell silent, hands clutching the edges of the case. Miss Marple nodded slowly, absorbing the significance. Charlotte Vale had not merely orchestrated the fake funeral. She had manipulated those around her to create the perfect cover for murder and subterfuge. The letters, the ledger, the telegram, they were all instruments in a larger plan, and Mrs. Pritchard had been an unwitting participant. "Do you understand now, my dear?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Someone with foresight, cunning, and patience has been guiding events, making others act while remaining unseen. The lilies at dusk, the telegram, even young Tom, he was a convenient messenger. And now, the ledger is safe. But the question remains, who will act next, and why?" Mrs. Pritchard shivered. I do not know, Miss Marple. I did not ask for any of this. I only wanted him, Harold, to be safe. And now," Miss Marple said gently, "we must wait and watch. Sometimes, the smallest gestures reveal the largest truths, and the cleverest of plots unravels not through force, but through observation." She closed the case carefully, standing, her eyes scanning the mist-shrouded pond. Somewhere among the shadows, Charlotte Vale or the mind behind her was still at work, and the next move would not be long in coming. Miss Marple turned toward the path leading home, her senses heightened, every rustle and shimmer catalogued. She had patience, she had insight, and above all, she had the ability to wait until the exact moment when the next revelation would fall perfectly into place. The evening was far from over, and Mary Mead had not yet seen the full measure of its quiet observer. The morning following her encounter at the pond broke with an unusual crispness, the air sharp and alive with frost that glittered on the hedgerows and caught in the thatched eaves of Mary Mead. Miss Marple walked slowly along the familiar lane, her senses alert to every detail, small depressions in the frost, a lingering scent of oil on the wind, the subtle way the light struck the garden walls. Each fragment of observation, she knew, could reveal more than an entire day's interrogation. By mid-morning, the village buzzed with cautious curiosity. The inquest's preliminary findings had been whispered through every doorway and hedge, and the story of Harold Pritchard's death had taken on layers that no one fully understood. While the coroner insisted on procedural calm, the townsfolk speculated wildly. Some suggested Mrs. Pritchard's involvement, others hinted at an old enemy returning for revenge, and a few even whispered of the mysterious woman from London, Charlotte Vale, whose reputation had preceded her like a shadow. Miss Marple, however, was not concerned with rumor. She had already seen the ledger, the letters, and the telegram. She knew the sequence of manipulations and the intentions behind them. What she needed now was to observe human behavior, the small tells and hesitations that would betray certainty from artifice. As she strolled past the post office, she noticed Tom Ellison loitering at the gate, fidgeting with a twig. The boy's shoulders were hunched, and his glance darted constantly toward the lane's end, as if he expected someone or something to appear. Miss Marple stopped him gently. "Tom, do you see how shadows linger on the frost? They often tell a story more clearly than words." Tom looked confused. I don't understand, Miss Marple." "Think carefully, my dear," she said softly. "When you last saw Mrs. Pritchard, what did she do that seemed most deliberate?" Tom hesitated, then remembered. She looked around, everywhere. Then she moved the case. She didn't just carry it. She placed it, like she wanted someone to notice. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed. And notice is what brings the next step in a plan to light. The cleverest people often believe no one sees them, yet those who watch closely see everything." Later that afternoon, she made her way to the Blue Boar, where Lily had prepared tea in a quiet corner. Lily's hands were trembling slightly, a tell that suggested more than fear, perhaps complicity or knowledge beyond her spoken words. "Miss Marple, there's something else," she said in a low voice. "I saw Mrs. Pritchard speaking to someone yesterday, near the churchyard. A woman, dark coat, hat pulled low. She handed her something small, like a key or a token." Miss Marple leaned back, letting the words settle. "A token," she murmured. "Tokens carry messages, and keys unlock more than doors." It seems that Mrs. Pritchard is not acting alone, or perhaps she believes she is merely a messenger. By dusk, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, noting the faint gleam of lamplight in several windows that were usually dark at this hour. She had learned over the years that the human mind acts predictably when fear and secrecy intersect, and she could almost chart the invisible pathways of deceit winding through Mary Mead. The lilies she had been instructed to watch would not reveal their secrets until nightfall. She prepared herself with a quiet tea and settled into her window seat. Knitting paused on her lap as her eyes followed the faint shadows stretching across the lane. Movement caught her attention. A gloved hand carefully brushing the frost from the gatepost near the Pritchard cottage. It paused, adjusted a small object, and disappeared. Miss Marple noted the gait, the careful precision of each step. Whoever it was, they moved as though every gesture were under scrutiny, because perhaps they were. She waited, silent and patient, until the street emptied and the air thickened with the hush of approaching night. Then she rose and walked to the lane herself, keeping to the shadows, keeping her senses alert. The pond. The lilies were indeed visible, their white petals luminous against the water's dark surface. Miss Marple crouched, examining the edges, and saw what she had anticipated. A small silver locket, half submerged, carefully placed among the reeds. It had been positioned deliberately so that only a careful observer might notice it. She retrieved it gently, inspecting the engraving. A pair of intertwined initials, not Harold's, not Mrs. Pritchard's, but a third, unfamiliar. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, piecing together the threads, the letters, the ledger, the mysterious visitor, and now this token. Whoever orchestrated these events had more than one agent at play, and they relied on misdirection to conceal the true puppet master. The night deepened, and Miss Marple returned home, the locket safe in her pocket. She poured herself a final cup of tea, reflecting on the careful choreography of deceit she had witnessed. Soon, she knew, the next move would be made. And, when it was, every small gesture, every shadowed step, every hint left in frost or ink would reveal the true mind behind the deception. In Mary Mead, Miss Marple thought, even the cleverest of schemes eventually unravels under quiet, patient observation. The morning light seeped softly through the curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting gentle shadows across the familiar furniture and the scattered knitting that had long since grown into an emblem of her quiet contemplation. She had spent the night reviewing every detail, the locket, the letters, the ledger, Tom Ellison's recollections, and the faint signs of movement near the pond. Each seemed a minor fragment on its own, yet together they formed a pattern of cunning and precision. As she stepped into the lane, the crisp air seemed charged with expectation. Frost clung to the cobblestones in irregular patches, each disturbance telling a story to those who knew how to read it. She noted prints leading toward the post office, prints leading away, some too small to belong to an adult, some narrow and light, suggesting a careful tread. The village had begun its usual routine, yet beneath the ordinary sounds of doors, gossip, and livestock, Miss Marple felt the current of unease flowing steadily. At the post office, Cherry Gibbs had arrived early, breathless and apprehensive. "Miss Marple," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder, "there's been something unusual. A man in a dark coat, tall, very straight, stopped here this morning. He asked questions about parcels to London, but he was very precise, like he was checking the names rather than sending anything himself." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Did he leave anything behind, my dear?" Cherry shook her head. "No, ma'am, but he left a card with only the initials C.V. written in fine, looping script." Miss Marple's mind clicked quietly into place. Charlotte Vale, undoubtedly. Her orchestrations were not merely whimsical, they were calculated and deliberate, using other people as instruments in a larger design. The initials on the card, the locket in the pond, the fake funeral, all pointed to a person who enjoyed control over narrative and perception. By midday, the Pritchard cottage stood quietly, its windows reflecting the pale sun like watchful eyes. Miss Marple approached under the pretense of calling on Mrs. Pritchard, but she had another intention: to observe, to note subtle reactions that might reveal complicity or fear. The door opened, and Mrs. Pritchard's expression was calm, almost serene, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor. "Miss Marple, how kind of you," she said, voice soft. "Do come in." Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. The wooden case rested on a side table, still closed. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it before speaking. "Your husband's ledger, the letters, the locket, they are all part of a story. Some of it you may not fully understand, my dear." Mrs. Pritchard's lips tightened. "I understand enough. I did what I could to protect certain truths. I never wished him harm, only safety." "Safety?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle, yet precise. "And yet he is dead. Perhaps not by accident. Someone else's hands guided the events, you see. And they have left traces, even if you were careful not to." Mrs. Pritchard nodded slowly. "Yes, I know. Charlotte Vale. She came to ensure I followed instructions. She promised that if I did, nothing would go wrong. But I did not anticipate Harold would. I did not know she would." Miss Marple waited silently, allowing the confession to unfold in its own time. Every hesitation, every faltering phrase, added clarity to the human picture behind the facts. Then she spoke softly. "The cleverest plots are often undone, not by action but by observation. You see, my dear, even Charlotte Vale cannot fully anticipate that someone will notice the small gestures, the deliberate placement of a locket, the half-seen shadow in a frosty lane." Later, as the sun dipped low, Miss Marple returned to her own cottage. She placed the locket on the table, alongside the letters and ledger, arranging them as if for a tableau. Her mind replayed every movement she had observed. The careful pacing of Mrs. Pritchard near the pond, the precise delivery of the telegram, the faint scent of paraffin, the stranger at the post office. Each piece was a note, in a silent symphony of control and deceit. By dusk, she had come to understand the ultimate intention: a psychological game, a manipulation of perception, a testing of human reactions. Charlotte Vale had orchestrated the fake funeral, the letters, the threat, and the locket, not merely to frighten or mislead, but to observe how people would act under pressure, to see who could be trusted and who would falter. Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting paused in her lap, eyes fixed on the fading light outside. The village had yet to see the full measure of Charlotte Vale's design, but Miss Marple had begun to trace the invisible lines, to understand the motivations and methods behind each subtle action. Soon, she thought, the next move would be made, and when it was, the puzzle would begin to unfold fully, revealing the mind behind the shadows and the pattern beneath the chaos. The following morning brought a brittle clarity to Mary Mead, the sun slicing through frost-laden hedgerows, glinting off the icy dew like scattered diamonds. Miss Marple walked deliberately along the lane, her coat drawn tight, eyes scanning every small irregularity. A bent twig, a faint smear in the frost, a footprint that seemed just a shade too cautious for an ordinary passerby. Each sign, seemingly trivial, hinted at movements and intentions that might otherwise go unnoticed. At the Blue Boar, Lily greeted her with a nervous smile. "Miss Marple, there's been something strange." Mrs. Pritchard was seen speaking with someone in the lane before sunrise. I couldn't see clearly, but it was a woman in a dark coat, hat low, carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Miss Marple inclined her head. "And did you notice anything about how she walked?" "Yes. She moved carefully, like someone hiding from a shadow. Yet every step was precise, controlled. I thought she might be Charlotte Vale, but I can't be sure." "Precision often accompanies intent," Miss Marple murmured. "Intent is more revealing than appearance." She made her way to the Pritchard cottage later that morning. The wooden case still rested where it had been placed near the sideboard, its lid slightly ajar now, as though someone had returned to confirm its contents remained undisturbed. Mrs. Pritchard was in the garden, tending roses with meticulous care, her expression calm yet taut. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said softly, glancing up. "I trust the day finds you well?" "Indeed, my dear." "And you?" Miss Marple's eyes, gentle but probing, lingered on her hands, noting the subtle tension in her fingers. Mrs. Pritchard sighed. "I am managing. The letters, the ledger, the locket. I keep them safe, as instructed. I follow what Charlotte Vale told me, though I never expected things to turn so grim." Miss Marple knelt by a flower bed, lifting a fallen petal with delicate fingers. "And yet, you see, my dear, following instructions is not the same as understanding the design behind them. There is more here than meets the eye. Every placement, every gesture is calculated to elicit a response to test reactions and expose weaknesses." Mrs. Pritchard looked down, brushing soil from her gloves. I do not know what to do. I feel I am part of something I cannot control." "That is precisely why observation is so vital," Miss Marple replied. "You are entangled in a web, yes, but one can study the pattern and anticipate the next thread." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the lane by the pond, her movements measured, her senses attuned to every rustle and shadow. The lilies, which had been the subject of the mysterious note, glimmered faintly in the late sunlight, petals reflecting the waning light like lanterns on water. She knelt, examining the reeds and the soft mud at the edge. There was a subtle indentation, consistent with the weight of a small case, and slight scratches along the stones where it had been dragged. The locket, she realized, had been a signal, a marker to guide the next action. Whoever had orchestrated the fake funeral and the delivery of the letters wanted someone, anyone, to notice, to respond, to reveal themselves in small, unconscious ways. Observation would force their hand. Miss Marple stood and surveyed the quiet village. Mary Mead was calm on the surface, but beneath the ordinary facades lay a network of intentions, anxieties, and secrets. Every villager, from Mrs. Price Ridley to Tom Ellison, had unknowingly participated in a larger scheme, and the mastermind, Charlotte Vale, or someone just as cunning, was orchestrating these movements with psychological precision. By evening, Miss Marple had returned to her cottage, arranging the letters, ledger, and locket once more on her table. She considered the timeline, the fake funeral, the drugged husband, the telegram, the mysterious visitor at the post office, the locket in the pond. All were deliberate. They formed a chain of psychological maneuvers designed to mislead, intimidate, and manipulate. She poured a cup of tea and settled into her window seat, eyes fixed on the lane below. Somewhere in the village, someone was planning their next move, testing limits, gauging reactions. Miss Marple's mind, however, was already several steps ahead. She knew the patterns of human behavior. The hesitation, the overcompensation, the tiny gestures that betray certainty. Patience, she reminded herself, was the most reliable tool in such investigations. The next revelation would come, not with noise or spectacle, but quietly, inevitably, as all truths eventually do. Mary Mead, she thought, may seem a peaceful village, but it had become the stage for an intricate game of observation and deception, and Miss Marple, quiet, composed, and endlessly perceptive, was ready to watch the final acts unfold. By the following afternoon, Mary Mead had taken on a curious stillness, the kind that comes before revelation. Villagers moved through their routines, eyes darting toward each other, whispers threading the air like fine mist. Miss Marple, with her keen eyes and quiet composure, observed everything. She had spent the morning reviewing every detail: the locket retrieved from the pond, the letters in Charlotte Vale's hand, the ledger, and the faint signs of Mrs. Pritchard's movements. Now, she intended to put the pieces to the test. to see which threads would unravel under subtle pressure. She began at the post office, where Cherry Gibbs greeted her with a mixture of relief and nervousness. "Miss Marple, I saw Mrs. Pritchard again, speaking with a lady in dark clothing near the churchyard. They seemed to exchange something, a parcel perhaps, but it was very brief." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, dear. Observation is often the key to understanding intention, and sometimes a small gesture speaks louder than words." She made her way to the Pritchard cottage, under the pretense of a friendly visit. Inside, Mrs. Pritchard's demeanor was careful and composed, yet Miss Marple noted the subtle tension in her hands and the brief flickers of her eyes toward the sideboard, where the wooden case lay. "Good afternoon, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "May I sit?" "Of course," Mrs. Pritchard replied, voice steady though her fingers tightened on her gloves. Miss Marple's eyes roamed casually over the room, noting the smallest details. The slight disarrangement of the ledger, a chair angled just so, the faint scent of lavender that suggested someone had lingered here recently. "I wanted to ask," she said, "about Charlotte Vale. You've been very careful in following instructions, but you must realize that a plan this elaborate cannot rely on one person alone. The smallest action can reveal the largest truth." "Miss Seuss," Pritchard's lips pressed together. I did what I was told. I never intended harm. I only kept things safe. And yet, harm has occurred," Miss Marple replied gently. "The cleverest manipulators rely on observation. They watch. They test reactions. Do you understand what I mean?" The widow nodded slowly, her composure faltering for a fraction of a second. That, to Miss Marple, was enough. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple orchestrated a small gathering, inviting key villagers under the guise of tea and conversation. She seated Mrs. Pritchard near the window, with young Tom Ellison on one side and Mrs. Price Ridley on the other. Each participant had unknowingly been involved in the chain of events, and Miss Marple intended to observe how they reacted under subtle prompts. She spoke lightly of the previous week's events, mentioning the fake funeral, the locket, and the letters in a casual tone. As if musing aloud, she noted Mrs. Pritchard's micro-expressions, Tom's restless movements, and Mrs. Price Ridley's shifting gaze. Then she introduced a small ruse. She mentioned a rumor of a visitor seen leaving the Pritchard garden that very morning. Mrs. Pritchard's hand trembled ever so slightly, and her eyes narrowed with barely controlled tension. Tom glanced at her, uncertain, while Mrs. Price Ridley muttered something about tricks and pretense. Miss Marple leaned back, knitting paused in her lap, and watched. The cues were clear to her trained eye. Mrs. Pritchard had acted under instruction, but her reaction to the suggestion of discovery betrayed anxiety beyond a reasonable measure. She was involved, but she was following someone else's direction. To confirm her suspicions, Miss Marple asked casually about the locket, describing it with meticulous accuracy. Mrs. Pritchard's eyes widened briefly, then she forced a smile, a gesture designed to hide knowledge she could not erase. Miss Marple noted the tiny hesitation, the flicker of recognition, the imperceptible tightening of the jaw. Finally, Miss Marple allowed a long silence to fall. Then she spoke softly, her tone both gentle and penetrating. "We all act in shadows sometimes, my dears, whether through fear, loyalty, or fascination. But the one who directs these shadows, who orchestrates fear and expectation, reveals themselves not through words, but through subtle pressure, the placement of objects, the arrangement of scenes, and the reactions they provoke. In watching these small movements, we discover the truth." The room held its breath. Even Tom, fidgeting with his coat, sensed the shift. Mrs. Pritchard's composure wavered imperceptibly, and Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. The final piece was nearly visible. The mastermind had relied on observation, misdirection, and the unwitting cooperation of others. By watching carefully, by noting gestures and reactions, the identity of the true architect of these events would soon come to light. Miss Marple settled back in her chair, calm as ever, knowing that within hours the psychological game would reach its next stage. Every subtle movement she had observed, every reaction she had catalogued, would contribute to the unraveling of Charlotte Vale's plan, and the village of Mary Mead would finally see the truth emerge from the shadows. Night had fallen over Mary Mead, and the village lay in a hushed expectancy, as though it, too, were holding its breath for the final act. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting abandoned on her lap, eyes sharp and thoughtful. She had observed, inferred, and waited. Now the moment had arrived to bring the threads together and expose the mind behind the chaos. She walked quietly to the Pritchard cottage, careful to note every shadow, every sound, and every sign of movement. Mrs. Pritchard met her at the door, pale but composed. "Miss Marple, I have tried to follow instructions, but I do not know what will happen next," she whispered. "Do not fear, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "All will be revealed, and those who act in shadows will be shown in full light. You have only played a part. The true architect of these events is about to be unmasked." Inside, the wooden case rested on the table. Miss Marple placed the locket, the letters, and the ledger before her, arranging them as if preparing a stage. She spoke in quiet, deliberate tones. "Charlotte Vale, or whoever has orchestrated this, has relied upon fear, misdirection, and observation. The fake funeral, the drug, the ledger, the private telegram, the locket in the pond. They were all instruments in a carefully designed psychological game. But even the cleverest manipulator cannot account for patient observation." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes widened slightly, her composure trembling for the first time. "You mean she wanted me to be involved?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "You were chosen because you would follow instructions without question, yet reveal the subtle traces of intent through your reactions. And those reactions have spoken clearly." As if on cue, a soft knock echoed at the door. Miss Marple rose and opened it. Outside stood Charlotte Vale herself, her dark coat glinting faintly in the lamplight, hat low over her eyes, a small case in her hand. Her movements were precise, controlled, confident, yet there was the faintest flicker of unease as she met Miss Marple's calm gaze. "Miss Marple," Charlotte said smoothly, her voice steady, "I presume you have discovered enough." "I have, Miss Vale," Miss Marple replied gently. "Your game has been elaborate, indeed. The letters, the fake funeral, the locket, the ledger, each action designed to manipulate, to frighten, to observe. And yet, all of it has led here. You relied on human predictability, but you underestimated patience, subtlety, and careful observation." Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly, a shadow crossing her carefully maintained composure. "And yet, I see no proof," she said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Proof is not always in paper or objects. It is in hesitation, in the flicker of a gaze, the tension in a hand, the choices people make when they believe no one is watching. Your accomplices, knowingly or unknowingly, have revealed more than any handwriting analysis could. The locket in the pond, the telegram, even young Tom's report, each is a mark of your direction. But those marks have guided me to you." For a long moment, Charlotte Vale said nothing, weighing her options. Then, almost imperceptibly, she let her shoulders slump, realizing her control had been quietly dismantled. The constables, called by Miss Marple beforehand and stationed discreetly nearby, emerged and moved to take her into custody, confirming her identity and the depth of her involvement in Harold Pritchard's death. Mrs. Pritchard sank into a chair, relief and exhaustion mingling on her face. "Oh, Miss Marple, I feared I had ruined everything." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "You were a pawn in a larger design, but a careful observer can always discern the game. You have acted with integrity where you could, and now truth is restored." By the following morning, The village was returning to its ordinary rhythms, though an undercurrent of unease lingered. Conversations had shifted from speculation to quiet reflection, and the story of the false funeral and the mysterious locket became a lesson in the subtle power of observation and human nature. Miss Marple walked through the lane, noting small details, the kind others overlooked, a faint smile upon her lips. She had untangled the web, revealed the manipulator, and restored a sense of balance to the village. Yet, as always, she reflected on the nature of people, their secrets, and the lengths to which they might go to conceal them. Even the cleverest plots, she murmured to herself, cannot escape the quiet vigilance of those who see with patience and understanding. And with that, she returned to her cottage, knitting in hand, the soft glow of the lamp reflecting the calm that had finally settled over Mary Mead.